So thank you for joining us today on the inaugural Aged Rights Advocacy Service World Elder Abuse Day online forum. Together we're better. My name's Anne Burgess and I'll be your MC today. I've been at ARAS since 2016 and I'm currently the chairperson of the board. We have about 319 people who've registered to be with us today, and so that's very encouraging for us that there are so many people interested in helping with this really important issue. Thank you also to our generous panellists who've taken time out in this very busy period to be with us today. We want, of course, to start with a welcome to country, and we're really disappointed because we had Lenore Bangara, who's a member of the ARAS board, and a Ghana Naranga woman who was going to do the welcome this morning. She's just phoned in to say she's not well, so we send her our best wishes. And instead, I would like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional owners of lands and waters across the land today. We pay our particular respect to them, their cultures, and to elders past, present, and emerging. And we hope Lenore is well again soon. So, as you know, ARAS usually hosts a face-to-face conference for WEAAD, World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. But because of the restrictions in place this year, it's online. And I'm sorry about that because I know the connections and the side discussions we usually have through the day are very valuable to all of us. But we're lucky to have a brilliant lineup of speakers who are very relevant to today's situation. Before we get to the presentation, I'll just go over a few housekeeping topics. We're recording today's forum and we hope that you'll share the link that we'll send you afterwards with your colleagues and your networks. We also invite your questions. We have some already, but you should be able to find a Q&A box on your screen. And if you think of a question for any of our speakers, please share it with us. Type under the speaker that you would like to answer your question. We will try to then make time to answer those questions, and we might hold the questions to the end. We'll see how we go with timing. But if we can't answer them today, we'll get back to you with responses to all those questions. So let's get underway. And we thought it'd be a bit of fun to run a couple of polls just to start with in just a few seconds, so that we can understand the demographics of who's with us today, who you are, and who you're representing. So the first poll is up on the screen now, and if you use your mouse just to type in or tick what of those categories represents you, and we'll be able to give you the response to that in a couple of seconds. So just give you a minute to click on that. So can we have the results now? So lots of service providers. Good to see the community members there, employees. Thank you very much for that. And the second one coming up now just tells us where you live across Australia, and we get a sense of that as well. In metro, rural, we put overseas because apparently we've got some overseas people who have registered for this. So can we see the results now? Metro, rural. Ah, and we've got 2 people overseas. Isn't that lovely? Thank you very much for that. That does help us. And nice to see the regional people. It's often, although we are saying online is not what we prefer, it is a way that older people in regional areas and people working with older people in regional areas can be part of our forum today. So the theme for 2020 WEAAD is Together We're Better. We can certainly do our part, all of us, to improve the overall wellbeing of older Australians. The support of family, friends and community services helps us and it helps an older person to retain control of their life, enhance their own wellbeing and help them to maintain their independence. We've heard that so often over the last month or so from older people. They want to be able to stay in control. And through working together, we can also ensure older people are aware of the supports available to them and how to access them. So this year has been very different for our World Elder Abuse Forum and its activities, but many of you did and are taking the opportunity to share your voice online. ARAS is running Age Rights Advocacy Service, I'll call it ARAS, is running a Facebook campaign. We're inviting community members to stand up and speak out to mark WEAAD, and we thank the many individuals who have participated so far, and we hope that more of you will do that. Of course, I need to give the following disclaimer, that the views of the presenters, the views of people online are not necessarily the views of ARAS. And the material is also of a general nature, and you should please seek professional advice if you need it. Before we move on to our presentations, I'd like to share a video with you. I need to acknowledge the National Ageing Research Institute, who has provided us with the opportunity to share this video. We wanted to show it because it just reminds us why we're here today and why we do what we do and who we do it for. So just a couple of minutes of the video. Thank you.
Good on you, son. Yeah. Come on. Yeah. It's very nice, isn't it? Oh. Ian, your father had a good day today. I'll see you next week. See you, Richard. Thanks, mate. Richard, I want you to sit down there on a chair and then I'll change the sheet. Yes.
Sorry, mate. Didn't realise you were coming in today. Dad, you need to get changed. He's a stubborn old man. Never does anything for himself.
Hey, Ian, your father seems to be a little more tired than usual. Does he eat anything today?
He has his food. I don't stand over him and make him eat.
Hi, Richard. How are you feeling today? There's few bugs in the corridor. Are you going on holiday? Or are you going somewhere? Richard.
Sadly, I think we all know where this is going. It's unfortunately a common scenario, and it does remind us why we're doing this important work. So I'd like now to ask the Honourable Stephen Wade, MLC, Minister for Health and Wellbeing, to open the forum. Minister Wade became South Australia's Minister for Health and Wellbeing in March 2018. He's a graduate of the University of Adelaide in law and economics. He's worked in politics, corporate governance, and on a range of boards. So from 2003 to 2006, for example, he was chair of the Julia Farr Services, the largest disability service provider in South Australia, and he's a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Since May 2006, 14 years ago now, Minister Wade has been a member of the Legislative Council of the Parliament of South Australia. And of course, for the last 3 months, he's guided us through a response to the pandemic across Australia. So over to you, Minister.
Thanks, Anne. I'd like to make a few acknowledgements. With us today are the Honourable Dr. Kay Patterson, the Age Discrimination Commissioner from the Australian Human Rights Commission, Janet Anderson from the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, Anne Burgess, of course our Chair, who's also Chair of the Age Rights Advocacy Service, Carolanne Barkla, Chief Executive of ARAS, Jeff Rowe, the Chief Executive of Aged and Disability Advocacy Australia, and Cassie Mason, who's the Director of the Office for Ageing Well in the Department of Health and Wellbeing. I'd like to join Anne in acknowledging that I'm meeting with you today on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I'd like to thank ARAS for the invitation to open this significant annual event. We are all part of this event today because we care. We care that elder abuse is happening in our society. We believe it shouldn't be happening, and we believe that we can do something about it. The Marshall State Government here in South Australia is strongly committed to promoting awareness of elder abuse and acting to safeguard the rights of members of our community who may be vulnerable to abuse. We are alert to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the safety of vulnerable people. Social distancing requirements imposed as part of the response to COVID-19 have restricted our movements and activities, and in many cases separated us from those we would normally spend time with. This minimised social contact is magnifying existing problems, including elder abuse. In the context of COVID-19, older people are required to spend more time at home, possibly with an abuser and away from their usual supports. 80% of elder abuse is committed by a trusted family member, often in silence and in secret. 50% of cases of elder abuse involve financial abuse. And as South Australian families and communities grapple with the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to make sure that older Australians know who they can approach for support if and when somebody tries to take advantage of them financially, be that a cold call approach from a stranger or someone in their immediate family putting pressure on them. SA Health's annual Stop Elder Abuse Awareness campaign began on the 3rd of May and will conclude at the end of June. And now more than ever, we as a community need to be alert to the signs of elder abuse. With COVID-19 restrictions lifting, we must all make a real effort to check on loved ones, neighbours and friends, being aware and looking for signs such as fear, sadness and neglect. The Marshall Government's landmark adult safeguarding legislation called Ageing and Adult Safeguarding Act, the first of its kind in Australia, came into effect on the 1st of October 2019. It was one of the earliest bills to be progressed by the state government after the election, reflecting our priority to protect the rights of vulnerable South Australians. The Adult Safeguarding Unit, which was established under the legislation, commenced operation on the 1st of October and has a strong focus on safeguarding the rights of adults at risk of abuse. The unit is located within the Office for Ageing Well, and its key functions include responding to reports of suspected or actual abuse of adults who may be vulnerable, providing support to safeguard the rights of adults experiencing abuse, tailored to their needs, wishes and circumstances. And lastly, the unit exists to raise community awareness of strategies to safeguard the rights of adults who may be at risk of abuse. For the first 3 years of operation, the unit is focused on responding to reports or concerns of abuse or neglect in relation to people aged 65 years and over, and 50 years and over for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander South Australians. The South Australian Elder Abuse Prevention phone line, which is based in the Adult Safeguarding Unit, is available if someone experiences, witnesses or suspects abuse. They can call the phone line Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. for information, support or to make a report. Since the unit commenced in October, staff have taken 670 calls, demonstrating what a vital tool the phone line is for people in need of assistance. To stop elder abuse, we need to work together. Every South Australian has a responsibility to safeguard the rights of older citizens and adults in vulnerable circumstances. The Office of Ageing Well can only reach as many people as it does through its partnerships with other government departments and with non-government organisations, many of which are with us here today. We are incredibly thankful for the partnerships that help the government to extend the Stop Elder Abuse awareness message far and wide. Feeling safe from abuse and harm is a basic human right, and the state government is committed to upholding it. It's up to all of us to advocate for the rights of older people in the community and work towards stamping out elder abuse in South Australia. Spread the word if you're being abused or you believe someone else is. Help is available. Now more than ever, we need to spot the signs, speak up and help stop elder abuse. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. I know that we've all got significant challenges as we come out of this pandemic and try to support older Australians to stop elder abuse.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's a timely reminder, isn't it, about the impact of COVID, particularly on older people, not just those people in aged care facilities, but people who are stuck at home maybe in that abusive situation. And also I think, you know, the theme of it's better together, you're reinforcing how important it is to get that message out about where people can get help and that help is available to them. We'll hear more from Cassie Mason about the safeguarding unit, so that was a really good introduction to that. So thank you very much for being with us today. We know you have got a very busy life and we appreciate that you've given us this time. Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks. So next we're going to hear from the Honourable Dr. Kay Patterson, who's the Age Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Appointed as Age Discrimination Commissioner in 2016, the Honourable Dr. Kay Patterson came to this role with a strong involvement in issues affecting older people. Kay is a great friend of the Age Rights Advocacy Service in South Australia, has been with us each time, I think, with our WEAAD conference, and she's doing that virtually around the country over this next week. So during her time in the Senate, she pursued issues affecting older Australians and fought tirelessly for the removal of the compulsory retirement 65 age for the Australian Public Service and for statutory authorities. She's been championing the rights of older workers, focusing on the blight of elder abuse and encouraging innovative solutions to homelessness and the risk of homelessness amongst older Australians. So thank you, Kay, for being with us today, and over to you to talk to us about ageism, elder abuse and the current context.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and I'm delighted to be with you virtually. I'm sorry, I really enjoy my trips to Adelaide, especially for WEAAD, And I'd like to thank ARAS for holding this virtual event. It's a whole new experience for us, and especially to Carolanne Barkla for us together in this most extraordinary of times. The theme for this year's WEAAD event, Together We Are Stronger, has particular significance at the moment as we experience various and changing physical distancing measures around Australia to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. The theme echoes the broader pandemic message, we are all in this together. When thinking about these overlapping messages in the current context, it's important to acknowledge that while a period of physical distancing is crucial, we mustn't lose sight that this doesn't have to equal social distancing. We also need to recognise and call out ageism when we see it. Now's the time for real intergenerational solidarity across all age groups, as various age groups are being affected. Young people are being affected, losing their jobs, all the troubles with, being at university, being at school or university, and older people are also affected. So everybody across age groups, parents with children trying to homeschool, it's been a challenging time for all of us. Elder abuse is really an extreme expression of ageism, resulting in harm. It may be physical, psychological, financial, sexual, or even neglect. And an example of ageism relevant to elder abuse is where attitudes tip the scale towards protection rather than respecting an older person's autonomy. We call this benevolent ageism. It's an extension of ageist views about the independence and agency of older people. And when these are taken to an extreme, these attitudes can result in elder abuse. For example, limiting an older person's social interactions or activities due to concerns about risk, whether in the current COVID-19 context or during normal times. We know that there are many risk factors for elder abuse, and these include isolation, the changing nature of these structures over time, such as who's caring for whom and expectations between generations, and financial pressures on children, such as rising housing costs or loss of a job. Social isolation is already a risk factor, but during COVID-19, as the Minister said, and I'd like to thank Stephen, Minister, for being here. It's wonderful. He's been at every one I've been at too, and he's taken a real interest in this area. And he indicated that people are at home more and they may be at increased risk because they're potentially spending more time in very close proximity with a possible perpetrator. These people may in turn, these perpetrators or potential perpetrators, may be experiencing COVID-19 related financial pressures as well as increased stress. Older people at risk may not be coming into contact with people outside their immediate circle, so not encountering people such as allied health professionals or others who may notice elder abuse red flags. I welcome the Australian Government's recent announcement of $6 million funding for 2 initiatives directed at older Australians to combat loneliness and social isolation. These are very important, especially during COVID. As older people stay at home, this also packs on everyday activities such as banking. Banks are encouraging people who use passbooks, and there are still about 500,000 people still using a passbook, encouraging them to use debit cards, and they're being sent out to them without people requesting them. Now, I'm concerned that an unintended consequence of this initiative is that it could exacerbate the risk of financial elder abuse. For example, if an older person seeks assistance and support from a family member who would not ordinarily have access to their passwords and accounts. So it's important for those of us working in the area, just remind people if they receive these debit cards, they don't have to use them, but if they need to because they can't get to the bank, that they need not to give those passwords to people because that they can't trust, and even sometimes that trust can be abused. As we spend more time online, which has its benefits for staying connected, there's also a need for older people to be tech savvy and aware of the creative scams that are proliferating at the moment. We need to be sure we're using the privacy settings available when engaging with online communication apps. So when talking to older people about this, I recommend, and I encourage you to recommend, them to look at Stay Safe Online. The Office of the E-Safety Commissioner has very valuable resources, particularly for seniors, at www.esafety.gov.au/seniors. So there are some resources there also for reporting through ScamWatch, and the Australian Government website has some very important information about COVID. While I encourage people to check in on their neighbours and other older community members, I've been told about cases which involve an older person being befriended by a neighbour who goes on to scam them after developing a relationship of trust. So families need to be careful and watching people who are a bit zealous about looking after a relative or friend who lives not near their family. So that's just another warning that we need to be aware that some people would take advantage during this time. I've been asked in recent weeks for evidence in order to raise the alarm on elder abuse. Now, I don't have ready proof to show you. We know that elder abuse doesn't end during a pandemic, and I've spoken to many advocacy services over the past few months. They tell me that they're concerned by the number of calls coming in, but they believe it may belie the true incidents because a number of people may be unable to call or walk into an office to get help. The very nature of and complexities around elder abuse, whereby perpetrators are close family members or others within an older person's circle of trust, means that older people are at risk may not have the privacy or safety to call a support line, such as the National Elder Abuse Helpline you see on the screen above. That number, particularly those of you who are watching from interstate, and I'd like to welcome you, I thought there was a significant proportion of you from interstate watching today, that number will redirect to the helpline in your jurisdiction. As I've phoned my contacts across Australia, I've heard for example, in Queensland, calls to Uniting Care's Elder Abuse Helpline increased by 15% between February and mid-March this year, compared with the same time last year. Their data indicates that in cases where the caller identified COVID-19 as a factor, the rates of financial and social abuse had declined. However, the rates of physical and psychological abuse had increased. Not only had the incidence of cases increased, but sadly, also the severity. The victim and perpetrator were living together in more than half the cases, and many of them were totally dependent on the perpetrator. There are even examples being reported of physical distancing being used by perpetrators to justify social isolation. For example, Caxton Legal Service in Queensland had a client being denied access to a husband who was being cared for by their daughter on the grounds of social distancing. Other examples include aged care packages being cancelled and fewer GP trips, compounding isolation. And that reduces the opportunities for outside eyes to identify red flags. In the ACT, Legal Aid has reported an increase of 71% in calls from last year. The vast majority of these concern elder abuse, particularly financial, while others relate to concerns about enduring documents. In Victoria, Seniors Rights Victoria has cited examples of older people moving into homes with their children, or vice versa, under the guise that look after them during the pandemic, only to find they're being shut away by their family, forced to live, eat and sleep in one room. And sadly, there was even one case where the older person was moved into the backyard shed. WA Legal Aid has increased its services, and this happened in March, to respond likely to the COVID-19 increase in the number of services required in high-need areas, including elder abuse, consumer protection and financial hardship. And Justice Connect has also reported an example of a son taking a mother's $750 economic support payment and telling her that she didn't need to go out, it was too dangerous, and persuading her she was not allowed to leave home. So used that opportunity to take that money. I'm also hearing from lawyers that there's an increased demand for enduring documents, including wills, powers of attorney and advanced care directives, as well as changes to mortgage documents. Now, I speak to a lot of older Australians and groups, and I actively encourage people of all ages to have their enduring documents in place. But it's absolutely vital that these documents reflect the wishes and interests of the older person, not those around them. And I'm concerned there may be a bit of pressure on older people to do their documents now that don't always express their wishes. In response, some jurisdictions have passed temporary COVID-19 related legislation to make electronic signing of enduring documents easier and loosen restrictions about witnesses. Now, there may be some benefits to this, but again, I'm concerned that this doesn't lead to financial elder abuse as an unintended consequences. It also concerns me that when I speak to groups of older Australians, that many of them are not aware that a power of attorney can be revoked. It's a message that all of us in this area, including lawyers assisting clients preparing their documents, we need to convey that it's not forever. They can change their power of attorney. As I mentioned before, we need to carefully balance autonomy and protection. And it's important to note that COVID-19 should not be used within families as a guise for removing an older person's independence. While the pandemic remains at the forefront of our minds, together we must not lose sight of the broader reforms needed to protect older Australians from abuse. We must call on the Attorneys General, who are meeting again in July, at the end of July, to speed up the timeline to harmonise power of attorney arrangements and to establish a national register for these documents. They've agreed on the latter at the last meeting. When it comes to countering ageism, we know that programs and relationships which foster intergenerational experiences and connections are the best way to reduce ageist attitudes. Who can forget that wonderful program, our Old People's Homes for 4-year-olds that the ABC recently produced? Fantastic and magical program. On an individual level, while events where older people can get information on the support available around elder abuse aren't able to occur, some simple things each of us can do is to foster intergenerational connection. We need to catch with older people, in particular those we know who are at risk of social isolation. While we can't be together physically at this time, we need to focus on how those of us working on elder abuse, advocacy, prevention and support can still work together to get the message out so that older Australians know they are not alone in this challenging time. I want to end by thanking all of you, and I'm delighted there are so many of you participating today, for your commitment and for all you do to combat elder abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kay. It's a really important message, isn't it? About so much of our time through COVID, we've been focusing on protecting older people, protecting health, protecting life. But there's a balance there about rights. That's important as well. And there's the question that's come in from Anthony. His question is, in all our past WEAAD conferences, we've talked about older people being able to make their own choices and take risks, to live full and social lives as they choose. But during the COVID lockdown, this seems to have been forgotten or ignored. And the government and providers have been putting in measures to protect them that have been, and still some are, extremely restrictive and impinged upon their rights. Did we ignore their rights and take away their ability to choose for themselves? Would you like to respond to that?
That's a very good point, Anthony. I was recently out for a walk, which we were allowed to do in Victoria because I'm bunkered down in Victoria, but the office is in Sydney. And this older woman was walking towards me, and I stopped and said, "Good afternoon," socially distancing, of course, or distancing physically, I mean. And she said, "I've just escaped." And I said, "Escaped from where?" And she said, "There." And she pointed to a very upmarket retirement village near where I live. And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "They said I couldn't go out for a walk." And I said, "Well, that's not right. You are there in a retirement village. You are following the government guidelines. You're allowed to go out for a walk and you are physically distancing. So you need to go back and say that you have a right to do this." She said, "But they won't let me go to my podiatrist tomorrow." I said, "Well, of course you can go to your podiatrist." I then told her who I was because I thought she needed a bit of backing. I don't normally do that when I'm talking to people in the street. But that just made me aware that people were maybe misusing the information. Now, I know it's difficult in nursing homes, and I've seen the trauma that one of my neighbours is suffering, not being able to visit her mother in the nursing home, and now only for an hour a day. But that is a balance between protecting the community and protecting the individuals. And we've seen outbreaks in nursing homes. I'm sure Janet Anderson, and I'm delighted she's with us today, will talk about this. But we need to make sure that as we move back from COVID-19, that we don't continue that imbalance between autonomy and risk. And I think that's one of the things we have to watch out for, for all of us, that we don't overprotect people. We let children do things that are a bit risky, and we need to enable older people to make decisions for themselves as well. But Anthony, it's a very good point, and I did actually mention it in my speech. Most probably didn't put enough emphasis on it, but I'm very focused on that balance between autonomy and protection.
Thanks very much, Kay. And thank you for being with us today. I'm sorry we can't do a clap all around the country, but thank you very much for being with us again today. So
Thanks,
now,
for having me yet again. Thank you.
Janet Anderson. So Janet, as many of you know, is the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. And she's a career public servant who for the last 20 years has held a range of executive positions at Commonwealth, state and regional levels, working in the areas of health and aged care policy, strategy and planning. After stints in the New South Wales Department of Health, the Commonwealth Departments of Vet Affairs, the Commonwealth Department of Health, she's been everywhere, this Janet. Janet took up the position of Deputy CEO and then Acting CEO of Northern Territory Department of Health. And while in the Northern Territories, she was also in charge of leading the government's response to the Royal Commission into Child Protection and Youth Justice. So she's something of a glutton for punishment, Janet, I think. In 2009, she was awarded a Public Service Medal for her contributions to health system policy. So today she's going to be talking about what we've just been alluding to, I think, protecting aged care consumers in the context of the pandemic. So Janet, we welcome you and we look forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Like the other speakers, very, very pleased to be with you today and looking forward to the balance of the conversation. Now, I do have some slides and I'm not able to drive them myself, so I'm in the good hands of the hosts as we move through these, and I'll talk to each of them. So perhaps we can go to the first in the sequence after this opening slide. Okay. For those of you who may be less familiar with the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, I thought I'd just very quickly run through the functions, the statutory functions of the Commission. I'm not proposing to spend long on this slide, but just to reacquaint you if we're not squarely in your view in your current line of work. We have principally 4 functions as set out here: consumer engagement, education, complaints resolution, and what is called in the Act regulation. Now, the fact is we are a regulator and we do all those things as a regulator, but there are a discrete set of functions which pertain to regulation as set out there. Beyond provider approvals, we accredit aged care providers, we assess performance, we review the quality of aged care services, we monitor and enforce compliance with the aged care quality standards and indeed the Charter of Aged Care Rights, and we also train our workforce of quality assessors. So that's the full suite of the work that we do. And if we move to the next slide, what becomes apparent is that we are exercising the full range of our powers in these extraordinary times. The opening dot point there is very important and probably does not need to be separately articulated. I think it's almost a truism that the community, all of us, are looking for reassurance that older people receiving aged care will be well looked after and kept safe. And so we have a particular job. Our Act, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Act, requires me to protect and enhance the safety, health, wellbeing and quality of life of aged care consumers. And we have doubled down on that since the pandemic was first declared. We are using the full suite of responsibilities under our Act to do our very best work in this area. We are engaging with consumers. We are certainly supporting providers with an abundance of advice, guidance and education on our website and in the information we are sending out to them. We continue to receive and act on complaints, and I'll have a bit to say about that. We have continued our site visits on a risk basis. So we are monitoring and assessing activities both in situ at particular residential services, but also in some of the other means we have available to us to keep an eye on what providers are doing. And where we find that a provider has drifted away from compliance with the aged care quality standards, we are taking enforcement action to insist on compliance and to ensure that they are on the track back to being fully in touch with and adhering to every aspect of those quality standards, which are in fact enforceable legal instruments. So the next slide sets out for you the background to the implementation of visitor restrictions in aged care. And in fact, Kay and Anthony, the person with the question, both I think were making reference to this. What we know about older people receiving aged care, and particularly aged care residents, is that they are among the most susceptible individuals to COVID-19. The epidemiology is clear on that. When they are more prone to contracting the virus, and when they have the virus, they are more prone to very poor health outcomes, possibly even leading to death. So it is a very discrete and particular set of circumstances that we find ourselves in, looking after and having responsibility for oversighting the care of very vulnerable older people. With that in mind, the National Cabinet took advice from chief medical officers around the country to introduce a set of restrictions on foot traffic to residential aged services. And this has been well talked about, and I doubt there's anyone online who is not aware that these restrictions have been put in place. What happens through the Australian Federation is that the National Cabinet makes a decision and then it is applied 8 times over by each state and territory through their legislative platform. Some of them have emergency management powers, others of them have public health orders. By various means across the country, each state and territory has put forward this subordinate legislation in order to create a set of conditions which on the one hand would exclude people from accessing an aged care service. So if they had symptoms of viral infection, if they'd recently returned from overseas, no longer a particular issue, but there are a set of exclusionary criteria. And then there are equally some criteria which would enable people to access an aged care service under certain conditions. And we put guidance out to the sector in the 3rd week in April. And you see the cover sheet of that guidance here on this slide. If you've not had a look at it, I commend it to you. What we do is set out with as much clarity as possible that our expectation of every single provider is that they apply the restrictions in their jurisdiction with compassion and care. And we go to some lengths to indicate what the standards require of aged care providers, and that the standards continue to prevail. There isn't some exemption clause which suddenly means the standards we can put to one side because, oh, there's a pandemic. The standards have never been more important, and they continue to be the guiding light in the expectations that the community has of aged care providers, and that we as the regulator would demand of providers when we look at their performance. So the 3rd dot point is about this caring and compassionate application of the restrictions, which achieves the balance that Kay spoke about so eloquently between, on the one hand, keeping the residents safe and ensuring that the risks of transmission of virus to individual residents and to the body of residents in a particular service is as low as possible, while at the same time ensuring that there is very strong attention given to maintaining their physical, psychological, emotional well-being. And those two must be kept in clear focus. The one cannot be privileged over the other. And what we're looking for, and what is generally expected of providers, is that they achieve a setting within their service and for access by families, which keeps both of those in clear view. Now, it is the fact, and it would be unsurprising, that providers have interpreted these provisions differently. Some providers have gone beyond the settings for a particular jurisdiction and have gone to what some have colloquially termed lockdown, which has prevented access by families who would normally have been seeing their loved one sometimes daily. And, you know, quite clearly, this has introduced some problems. The next slide tells a particular story in relation to the concerns that residents have registered with us about the visitor restrictions. Now, I'll need to orient you to these bars. We have had a very significant increase in the total number of complaints received year on year across the 3 months to March, April and May, a 16% increase in total complaints. And that is largely attributable to the additional complaints which we are receiving in relation to COVID-19. And as you can see here, the COVID-19 related complaints inquiries peaked in that last week in April into the first week in May, 363. And as indicated on the side of the slide there, the top three themes were visitor restrictions, concerns about the service's degree of preparation for a potential outbreak, and the impact of the restrictions on the quality of care and services, because families were becoming concerned that in the absence of physical access to their loved one in care, they were no longer as confident as they wanted to be that their relative was being well cared for. So moving to the next slide, and this hopefully would also be known to you, COTA, to their great credit, led a very rapid fire development of an industry code on visitor access, because they saw, alongside us and a number of other consumer-facing organisations, that this was becoming a difficulty, that the differences in interpretation that providers were placing on the local restrictions requirements, the orders, were causing difficulties. And indeed, we were seeing that coming through our complaints line. So a very intensive consultative process led to this industry code for visiting residential aged care services during COVID-19. If you've not seen it, I commend it to you. It can be found on any number of websites, and I'm quite sure ARAS would be able to point you in its direction very readily. It's worth reading. And what it sets out is a caring and compassionate approach to enabling families to access their loved ones in care under certain conditions. The other document on this slide is the document that we, the Commission, produced in response to the code, which gave clarity to the way we would regulate against the code. Now, our regulatory reference point are the quality standards, but what we've said very clearly in our fact sheet is that we would have regard to a provider's adherence to the code when we assess them against the standards. So if that's clear, we would ask them questions about, so this is the code, how are you complying with the code, which is industry best practice? And if they are at variance from the code, that would inform our understanding of their performance in the larger context of the aged care quality standards. This code was very significant for a number of reasons. It demonstrated sector or industry leadership on a matter of controversy. So a shout out to the sector on this, that they saw the need to take leadership and to provide guidance to all providers, which provides a platform for an informed conversation between family members and residents and providers about reasonable access. And we're already receiving, and indeed you can see from the complaints data I put up, that after the code was released in the second week in May, the complaints numbers diminished. And we believe that there's a correlation there, because families were more able to have an informed conversation and a shared expectation with the provider about what reasonable access looks like. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it's all rosy, because there continue to be families who are concerned about the ways in which they can access their relative in care. The vast majority of providers are doing the best they can and approaching code adherence. They're also very, very energetic about providing supplementary means for families to access residents and vice versa, through Skype or Zoom or whatever platform enables video access. They are also being more proactive in making outbound calls to family members to report on the well-being of their loved one in care. So there is much which has changed, which has more or less successfully navigated this really difficult time, where we're trying to strike the balance, as I say again, between keeping the residents safe and ensuring that their well-being, their holistic well-being, is looked after in that context of safety and security. The next slide indicates some of the resources that we, the Commission, have produced and which are available on our website to assist providers and also to assist consumers in having these conversations one-on-one, so that a family's needs are understood, a resident's needs are understood, and a provider is doing their best and demonstrably working hard to ensure that the access arrangements for that resident are as good as they can be. And of course, we continue to encourage people to contact us, our complaints line, which is a free call number, an 1800 number there on the slide, if they continue to have concerns that even after their engagement directly with the provider, they've not managed to land satisfactorily an arrangement which suits all parties and which gives families the level of reassurance that they're looking for, that their loved one is being well cared for. The next slide points to some of the other areas of action that the Commission is taking, because I wanted to round out this story by reassuring people that we continue to have visibility on site. There has been some misinformation promulgated by some in relation to the cessation of all visits on site. That is not so. We have had to adjust our regulatory practice in light of the COVID-19 risks, and no one would be surprised by that. We have an obligation to our staff, we have an obligation to aged care services to ensure that we are meticulous in our infection prevention and control practices. But we continue to visit sites where we identify a heightened level of risk in relation to infection prevention and control or to residents' well-being. And as it says there, we've actually conducted 165 site visits from the beginning of March right the way through to the middle of May. And indeed, that number has gone up since this data was prepared. Many of those have been undertaken at short notice. We typically would do them unannounced, but that introduces additional risk just at the minute. So we do most of them for the moment at short notice, but we're moving back from the beginning of June to more of them on an unannounced basis. We've also amplified our reach by undertaking online self-assessment surveys and telephone contacts. We have made over 2,500 telephone calls in the last 6 weeks to every single residential aged care service, every single home care service, and we've run them through their paces. We have asked them a series of questions about their preparedness for the pandemic, about what they know about their consumers and their well-being, and the steps they are taking, the additional steps they are taking to ensure their well-being in these exceptional times. In the main, we've been reassured. That's not been universal. There have been some responses which have heightened our level of alert. And where we have additional questions, we have gone back to a provider. And where questions remain, we have scheduled them for a visit by my quality assessors in order that we can be on the ground, asking questions directly of consumers and their family members, of staff, looking at what we observe by way of the interactions and what is happening in that particular service. So we have and continue to deploy all of the regulatory tools available to us to keep people safe and to ensure that their well-being is at the forefront of providers' minds. We remain vigilant, and the final slide provides the contact details that I always put up at the end of my presentations to remind people about where they can find us online at the end of a phone and indeed in relation to social media. We continue to be on the alert, and we know that providers continue to be on the alert. The pandemic is not yet over, and we're many weeks, if not months from that. We have a Prime Minister who has announced a 3-step process to a COVID-safe Australia. Consideration is being given to how that steps out in aged care, and I understand that Chief Medical Officers are talking about that today, this week, certainly this month, and that there will be announcements about that in due course. We are watchful for what those announcements will be, and as a regulator, we stand ready to ensure that the sector is well informed about the steps that they would be expected to take by the community and by ourselves as we move to a post-pandemic COVID-safe Australia. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you very much, Janet. I'm just watching some of the questions coming in now, and I think that you've covered a lot of them. There are people who are concerned in what they call lockdowns, in that the family aren't able to provide that set of outside eyes into what's happening, and you might want to refer to that. There are also Sarah and others are saying the code was a shout out to AXA and OPAN and some of those other agencies who were also involved with COTA in the code.
Sure.
And a reasonable question from Kerry about how long in this new normal will the code remain in place? So if you have a view about that, and that concern that I imagine is around all the time about if you don't have unannounced visits, then providers spend a lot of time getting ready for the visits, and maybe that doesn't show the real situation in those aged care facilities. So we've just got a couple of minutes if you'd just like to range across those questions.
Sure. Absolutely. I didn't mean to exclude the others who are involved in the development of the code. It was a joint effort, and I did say well done to the sector for leading that. COTA was alongside 13 other major leaders in the sector, all of whom worked very diligently to land it. It has recently been reviewed, and the conclusion of that review was that it was still fit for purpose. My understanding is that that group of 14 is doing development on a question and answer sheet, which will provide further elaboration and clarification of matters of interpretation in terms of the way in which the code should reasonably be implemented. So that's a further piece of work which I believe is underway. And as for how long it will last, I think it will have reference to my comments in relation to the stepping out away from the pandemic. With the very, very low rates of community transmission, I think it would be a reasonable expectation that over time there would be some relaxation. And I think then it becomes a question for the clinical advice as to the rate at which that occurs. But I think we could have a reasonable expectation that we would see that in coming weeks and months. And I think we all stand by for the clinicians' expert advice as to the pacing of that relaxation. I'm very aware of the views in relation to announced and unannounced visits, and that's specifically the reason that we have recommenced unannounced visits. We are no longer giving notice in every case of a site visit, and we will increasingly rebalance that and give notice in fewer cases and return fully to unannounced visits in coming weeks and months. We are not in a position to do that yet on the basis of good clinical advice, that there are some circumstances where a short period announcement, which is typically less than 24 hours notice, is an appropriate precautionary measure. But as I say, we are stepping fairly rapidly back to our previous setting, and which is our preferred setting, which is that we do not give notice of the visits that we make on site. And we have continued to make site visits right the way through the pandemic. I do understand, and it is a matter of ongoing interest, I know, that the restrictions on visitors are not allowing some families the level of access that they would like. What we're managing to demonstrate is that if individuals come to us and raise their concerns, we then take them to the provider. And in many cases, not every single one, but in many cases, the provider hasn't possibly fully understood the family's concerns or what they want or need, and an agreement can be brokered which is mutually satisfactory, so that provider's comfortable that the risks are being well managed, the family is happy with where they've landed in terms of the access arrangements, and the resident, most importantly at the very centre of the picture, is comforted that there are precautionary measures in place, but that they can still get access to their family. So we are, in many instances, seeing a satisfactory resolution of a concern where those conversations happen one-on-one.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you for such an open and informative presentation. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So now we're moving on to hear from Carolanne Barkla. So Carolanne, as many of you will know, is the Chief Executive of ARAS, and she's been in that role since April 2016. She brings to that role over 20 years experience as a registered nurse. Looking at her, you'd never think 20 years, Carolanne. Registered nurse, lawyer and executive spanning health, aged care, legal, not-for-profit, policy, sector development and social justice. She's been recognised for her academic excellence for elder law, comparative aspects of Malaysian law and legal research into compulsory reporting in aged care. She's currently a board member of Elder Abuse Action, EAAA, chair of the End of Life Directions for Aged Care, LDAC, a national reference group, member of the South Australian Health Adult Safeguarding Advisory Group, and was appointed to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Advisory Council in April 2019, and still has time to be Chief Executive of ARAS in all of that. So in her annual tradition, Carolanne will present her State of the Nation report. Carolanne, over to you.
Thanks, Anne. I am covering what ARAS has called the State of the Nation in a substantially shortened version suitable for this webinar. The topics to be covered today are some fast stats on ARAS's outcomes for the financial year in 18-19. I'm also going back to the Australian Law Reform Commission report that was launched about 3 years ago. And I'm giving a quick snapshot of the recommendations again. And then I'm focusing on the national plan and with 3 key areas, focusing on compass, enduring powers of attorney and aged care. And finally, just a little bit about the COVID-19 impact. So let's get started. As I know that Anne is going to be timed with her timing this and poised, ready to ding. So ARAS fast stats for 18-19. We had 1,743 individual advocacy cases, 1,048 information inquiries. We delivered 425 education sessions to 10,685 participants. We had 53,003 website page views, and we had 7,028 contacts from the public. I really encourage you to read our annual report that can give you a great more detail in terms of what we have achieved in 18-19. As you can appreciate, we haven't closed off our stats. We haven't got quite to the end of the financial year. But I encourage you to keep an eye on our website for further information. So let's now turn, next slide, perfect, to the Australian Law Reform Commission report that was launched, as I said, 3 years ago. And from some people who have been on this webinar and have previously attended WEAAD, they would know my passion for a comprehensive framework to support change that has a clear focus on balancing dignity and autonomy on the one hand and protecting and safeguarding on the other. As Commissioner Kay Patterson and Janet Anderson have identified, the balancing act between autonomy and dignity on one hand and protecting and safeguarding on the other is not easy. So we have this framework, and the Australian Law Reform Commission made 43 recommendations in 10 key areas. The report was really, the ALRC report was comprehensive and recognised the complexity of the issues that span the jurisdictions and required a whole of government's response. The response, next slide please, and the recommendations cover an overarching national plan and made recommendations to changes in aged care, to enduring appointments, to family agreements, to superannuation, to wills, to banking, to guardianship and financial administration, to social security, and to safeguarding adults at risk. It's a comprehensive agenda. My focus today is on just touching on the plan. So next slide, please. And the plan was launched on the 19th of March, endorsed by the Council of Attorney Generals, agreed to a shared understanding of abuse of older Australians, and had 5 priority areas. The plan built upon the Australian Law Reform Commission recommendations. And as you can appreciate, 10 minutes is not going to cover off on everything. So I just want to alert you to one of the key areas that was a priority area. As we know that the Australian Law Reform Commission report was a national legal response, but we all know that laws alone do not fix the problems. They require community awareness campaigns, they require resourcing for support services, and they also need financing. And one of those priorities that was agreed upon under the national plan was to ensure that there was a national knowledge hub. So the national knowledge hub, called Compass Info, next slide please, has commenced being built. Now, there may be some criticism of not another online forum. However, older people themselves were telling us, why do we need multiple different phone numbers to get to an elder abuse phone line? So there is a national phone line, and we do know that it drops down to the relevant area in jurisdictions so that support services can be sought and provided. Compass is also meant to be a repository of information and bringing together all of the resources that have been developed across the country. One of the reasons for Compass is to stop reinventing the wheel. There's multiple resources, let's bring them together, let's look at what can work. There's also a service directory where older people themselves can search for support services that are local to them. It's the commencement of having a one-stop information shop online for all of these resources. Now, we also know that, of course, older people absolutely need face-to-face services as well. So I also encourage you all to take part in the inaugural webinar next Monday being hosted on Compass with the guest editor, Dr. Catherine Barrett, on the uncomfortable truth about the sexual assault of older women. Quite a challenging subject, but one that everyone should consider. I'm now going to turn my presentation to enduring appointments. And I acknowledge that Commissioner Kay Patterson has already identified some significant issues in terms of the national consistency laws. There's clearly the need to have national laws across the country. Older people themselves tell us, why should I need a different document when I move from one state to another? Why are they different? They're very confusing. What does it mean, you know, jointly or severally? The language is very difficult to understand. We need consistent laws across the country. I'm delighted to say that the South Australian Attorney General has announced that there will be consultation on the role and operation of powers of attorney in South Australia, with a focus on looking at other jurisdictions and hopefully aligning to national consistency of laws. Older people themselves in the community have raised the concerns. They said that the attorney was found to be doing things like draining their bank accounts of the person that had entrusted them with the power to act on their behalf and transferring property into their own name, basically leaving the principal with nothing, and then the older person being financially destitute. In terms of, we need a national online register. The national register needs to be mandatory. That is, it needs to be properly resourced. It needs to be practical to use. It needs to be affordable. It needs to also address privacy and consent concerns and facilitates the making of and reliance upon substitute decision-making documents. I now turn my presentation to aged care. So on the left-hand side of my PowerPoint are areas that have been to date addressed. So there is an Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, and we've heard from the Commissioner today, and there were substantial transitional powers that commenced in 1 January 2020. We've heard from the Commissioner about unannounced visits. There is a clinical advisor who has been appointed, an experienced geriatrician, Dr. Melanie Roth, to provide practical assistance and support to the Commission around clinical issues. Restrictive practices. There has been regulations for restrictive practices put in place. ARAS remains concerned about the issue of chemical restraint and looks forward to a review of those regulations. The new accreditation standards have been implemented, and there's an Aged Care Charter of Rights that requires the service provider to sign off on those rights, turning their mind to making sure that older people have their rights acknowledged. More work needs to be done in this space. Of interest to ARAS is the Serious Incident Response Scheme. We await more information on the implementation of such a scheme, and the scheme needs to be as transparent as possible. Current information, such as raw data that says this number of people have reported to the Department of Health and to the police, the actual unreasonable use of force or allegations of unlawful sexual contact do not provide adequate transparency to the community as to what is occurring. It is also critical that the information going forward provides us with that information about what are the big issues occurring in residential aged care, but also in the community. So the Serious Incident Response Scheme should be considered to be further broadened to go across into home care. The scheme needs to be proportionate and needs to clearly balance the outcomes for older people. The focus needs to be on ensuring that there is an appropriate timely response that puts in place counselling, behaviour support services, criminal investigations, and various other things. I will now, given time pressures, I'm now going to just make a couple of comments around the next slide is COVID-19 impact. ARAS has been certainly supporting many older people, and we continue to do so. I do have to advise that we are concerned about the assertion of property rights in terms of providers saying that over and above the access code, we're not going to allow care and support visits, and it's our property, and so we have the right to actually say, no, you cannot come onto our property. We will be addressing this in a submission to the Aged Care Royal Commission, and I would just encourage any older people living at home, if you are concerned, please contact the COVID support line on 1800 171 866. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. These things happen, as you would know. My laptop's just gone flat, and so I've switched over into Carolanne's seat, so I hope that's all right. So thank you, Carolanne. Sorry for that disruption. So next we're going to hear from Jeff Rowe, who's the Chief Executive of Aged and Disability Advocacy Australia, based in Queensland. So Jeff Rowe has occupied the role of CEO of ADA Australia since September in 2014. His career in human services sector spans more than 30 years, including 15 years in senior and executive positions in the Queensland Government and more than 20 years in the not-for-profit sector. Prior to his current role, Jeff has held senior roles with Endeavour Foundation and Cerebral Palsy League of Queensland. In November 2018, importantly, he was awarded the prestigious Paul Tice Churchill Fellowship to study world's best practice in preventing and responding to elder abuse in aged care in the community. And in 2019, he travelled to the UK, to Canada, US and New Zealand to complete his fellowship. He has a strong interest in social justice and inclusion. And so welcome, Jeff, and he's going to talk to us about can we do better? Observations from the Paul Tice Churchill Fellowship. Thank you, Jeff, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Anne, and good morning, everyone. If we can perhaps go to the next slide, I am mindful of time. Jules Verne certainly took 80 days to traverse the world. I, on my fellowship, over 6 weeks, some 50 days, visited 30 organisations, and my challenge this morning is to try and take you with me around the world in less than 10 minutes. So as Anne indicated, I had the fortune of being awarded the Paul Tice Churchill Fellowship. And it took me to New York, to Vancouver, Anchorage, Edinburgh, London and Wellington. And I guess perhaps if we move to the next slide, I really wanted to, as part of the acknowledgement this morning, I had the fortune when I was in Vancouver of meeting with Dr. Gloria Gutman, who for most of you will say, you know, who the hell are you? Gloria was one of the co-founders of WEAAD. So I thought it important today to actually acknowledge the work that she had done, particularly, you know, given today's theme of Together We Are Better. The work of Gloria and others has meant that elder abuse worldwide is a focus of attention at least one day a year. So thank you, Gloria. Moving on to the next slide. Thanks. My motivation for the Churchill Fellowship was a result of hearing many of my colleagues express frustration at the fact that our response to elder abuse was some 20 years behind the response to domestic and family violence here in Australia. Frustrations also were expressed regarding a lack of human rights approach informing our response and interactions with older Australians. So not just in respect of elder abuse, but in respect of interactions more broadly. And we certainly have heard some of the previous speakers touch on, you know, ageism, the lack of focus on rights. One of my findings in the fellowship is that perhaps we're not as far behind the rest of the world as I thought, but I do know that we can learn from the overseas experience. And that learning, some of it will be about what works, but some of it's also about what doesn't work. Let's not try and reinvent a wheel. Let's not try and go down the same rabbit hole as others. My report has made recommendations across 12 areas of exploration. Today, I'm really focusing on only a couple of those, and more so specifically, if we can go to the next slide, on collaboration. And given we're talking about being better together, I thought it was interesting to share some observations from both New York and New York State, as well as those in Vancouver. When I was in New York, I had the opportunity of visiting Lifespan in Rochester. For me, I thought it was somewhere very close to New York. I found that it was something like 6 hours drive and a very long way away. After that initial traumatic find, I found myself a plane and I got to visit the service. Across New York, they are operating a series of MDTs, so they're multidisciplinary teams. And indeed, Lifespan in Rochester is being an incubator for an enhanced MDT. What's an MDT? It's basically a group of professionals who come together on a regular basis. Most of the MDTs meet at least monthly. They focus on investigating, intervening and preventing financial exploitation of older people. Those multidisciplinary teams operate very much on localised responses and they take individual cases into account. What makes them different to what we're doing here in Australia? For me, the overwhelming sight that I saw, that it involved many players and a lot more players than we traditionally get around the table to talk around elder abuse. So an EMDT comprised a coordinator, the Adult Protective Services, a geriatrician, someone from the District Attorney's Office, law enforcement, the police were absolutely there, and a forensic accountant. They were the core members, and beyond that, they pulled in as required other elder abuse prevention providers, civil legal service providers, banks and credit unions, financial advisors, domestic service providers, the Ombudsman, even the tax office got a look in at the EMDT meetings. So they really have they have the capacity to pull anyone in at any time who is relevant to that case. Related to that was the work within New York City itself. What was really obvious was very close linkages with medical services, with research institutions and the police. I had the opportunity of going to a meeting in NYPD, which had 120 police officers who come together once a month to talk about their response to domestic and family violence, elder abuse and mental health services. And it was quite informing, I guess, that collaboration that operated. Even when I went to visit the New York Elder Abuse Centre, one of the people there was the local police officer who looked after elder abuse. So those links were very strong. The collaboration was very strong. Similarly, in Vancouver, they operate a series of community response networks, and that's supported by the British Columbia Community Response Network, and that provides funding and support to the local community response networks who are supporting adults in their local communities who are experiencing abuse, neglect and self-neglect. The network provided funding. It also facilitated monthly provincial teleconferences. And I guess to give you a really short idea of the number of networks and the extent, across British Columbia, they operate 78 networks. 8 are located in Vancouver City, and that includes a First Nation community response network, 2 LGBTI CRNs and a Chinese-speaking CRN. So very much focused on who are we servicing and what are we trying to do. Moving on to the next slide, I'm mindful of time, and I really just wanted to pick up a couple of the highlights that I saw. Mandatory reporting, while not operating in every jurisdiction, was certainly an important part of the response to elder abuse. What I saw it do was to move elder abuse out into the mainstream in much the same way that it's happened in child protection in Australia. If we go to the next slide, as I said, I'm going to fly through these. While there's been some debate across the world, the overall impression I came home with is that the criminalising of elder abuse is extraordinarily important, and is something that, as Australians, that we have to consider. Frequently we hear that elder abuse is a family matter. It's not a family matter, it's a crime. And while we have some statutes that allow prosecution, the navigation of those is so complex that it is really difficult for someone to go through that process and end up with a conviction. I'm not necessarily suggesting that everyone, must be prosecuted. Obviously, it's a choice of the older person in terms of whether or not they want to proceed with that, but I think that option has to be available. Moving to the next slide, rural and remote services. I was really keen to see what was happening elsewhere around rural and remote, because that's something in Australia very much has been challenging. And I know OPAN did some work a couple of years ago with the Curtin University, just trying to look at models that existed and really struggled to find models within Australia and elsewhere. There's been some fabulous work undertaken, and maybe we go to the next slide because it also impacts on the Indigenous responses to elder abuse. There's been some fabulous work undertaken in Alaska by the South Central Foundation, and they have what's called the NUCA model of care, which very much is directed by the older person and driven by the older person. In Vancouver, the British Columbia Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres was also supporting. It was led by Indigenous people. It was supporting wellness, health and prosperity. Interestingly, in my conversations with the BC Friendship Centres, they identified that spiritual abuse was something that was very important within the Indigenous community, and they described that spiritual abuse as being isolation from tradition and from language and from not having connections with youth. And I think that's something that's worthy of us looking at ourselves. Moving to the next slide, my final remarks or my closing remarks are really that my fellowship exploration affirmed the understanding that elder abuse is underreported and our response is inadequate. In New York, there'd just been some research done which suggested that less than 1 in 24 people who had experienced elder abuse reported that abuse. So while we talk about our numbers being somewhere between 4 and 12% and 185,000 people, I suspect we really are underestimating the number of people. Collaboration, as I've tried to touch on very briefly, has been a powerful tool in preventing and responding to elder abuse. Together we are indeed better. To get that collaboration, we need investment, we need support by government in both the short, medium and long term. We know that elder abuse occurs in all communities and doesn't discriminate. My final closing mark is that we really need to link with and share the experiences of elder abuse agencies overseas. There is a real opportunity for us to learn from what others are doing and to bring that back here to inform our practice, to modify it to suit Australian conditions and to progress our response to elder abuse. We'll go to the next slide, which just really asks for questions, but move on to the final slide, which just gives you some contact details. And if you're interested in reading more about my observation, the middle link there is a link on the Churchill Trust site to my fellowship report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I always think that elder abuse is tracking behind where we've come from in domestic and family violence, where we've moved domestic and family violence as something that happens behind closed doors into the criminal system. And I think elder abuse is tracking behind that and needs to move forward. So thank you very much for that. I think as well, you've given us some enthusiasm about new models that can emerge and the importance of those networks. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
That insight. We are really running tight on time, but I'm hoping you can all stay with us because last but certainly not least, we have Cassie Mason with us. Hello, Cassie. Cassie's Director of the Office for Ageing Well in South Australia. She is focused on developing and implementing dynamic and innovative social policies and programs to support older people in South Australia. She currently has a portfolio responsibility for state ageing policy, the South Australian Aged Care Strategy, retirement villages, seniors cards, ageing community grants, and South Australia, as the Minister referred to in the opening, South Australia's new adult safeguarding unit established under landmark legislation. She's also leading an Australian first CCTV pilot. I'm sure you all know about that, to explore whether this type of audio-visual surveillance technology has a place in aged care facilities to improve the safety and wellbeing of residents. So Cassie, over to you about the adult safeguarding and COVID-19.
Thanks, Anne. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to be part of this today. And I really wanted to talk to you a little bit about, I suppose, adult safeguarding and also maintaining social connections in the context of COVID-19. So firstly, I'd just also like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is, well, at least the land I'm on today, is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So although restrictions are easing in our communities and we're starting to open up a bit again, South Australians really have been separated for a number of months. Our movements have been restricted, the activities we can do, and in many cases we've been physically separated from the people that we normally spend time with. So unfortunately, this decrease in social contact has been magnifying existing problems such as elder abuse. Older people in particular have been advised to stay at home and self-isolate as much as possible, get their groceries delivered, don't do anything non-essential in the way of travel. And that's to stay safe from COVID-19, but that's really kept people away from their usual social supports, and we know it's increased social isolation. And we also know that social isolation is a significant contributing factor to elder abuse. So that these past few months really have been quite an uncertain and unsettling time for many. So our work to support older South Australians has really had to adapt to meet those new and emerging issues that have arisen over this period. As many of you hopefully know, our annual Stop Elder Abuse Community Awareness campaign launched in the midst of the COVID-19 restrictions on the 3rd of May and continues to the end of this month. So really this year, those campaign messages of, check on your loved ones, your neighbours and your friends, be alert for those signs of elder abuse such as fear, sadness and neglect has really served as an especially timely reminder. Now more than ever, it's really important to check on those older people that you know. We know that every year when our community awareness campaign's underway, calls to the South Australian Elder Abuse Prevention phone line increase. And this year has been no different. We've had, in May, 42 reports have been received by our Adult Safeguarding Unit, which is actually the highest number of reports we've seen in a single month so far. So as was mentioned previously, the Adult Safeguarding Unit has been open since October last year and provides free confidential advice and support in relation to elder abuse, as well as taking reports of actual or suspected abuse. Between the commencement of the unit and the 31st of May this year, the phone line, which is the portal to the unit, has received 620 calls. So of those, 372 were requests for advice or information, and 248, or about 40%, were actually reports of abuse. As you'll all be well aware, abuse can be financial, psychological, physical, social, neglect, sexual or chemical, such as over or under medication. Our data shows that about 50% of cases of abuse are financial, often coupled with emotional abuse. Older women are more likely to be experiencing the abuse, and that's more commonly from an adult son or daughter. As was just mentioned previously around, elder abuse being a crime, there are lots of, pros and cons around that, because we know that many cases of elder abuse, the older person involved actually, doesn't want to report it to SAPOL. They want the abuse to stop. But what's really, really important to them, as well as that, is to actually also maintain the relationships that are really important to them. We know that some of these situations are just really, really complex. They have a range of family dynamics that are at play, and some instances involve feuds between family members that have actually been raging over decades. And so sometimes we've had actually different calls from different members of the same family saying completely different things about the same situation. And that's where we can really come into play to actually, investigate and work through that, those complexities further, working with and for the older person to support them in what safeguarding is appropriate and they feel comfortable with. So the ASU, or the Adult Safeguarding Unit, takes all of reports really seriously, and we have a statutory responsibility to respond once we receive a report. So that might include investigating the situation further and working with the person and their family to provide education around the rights of the person. So sometimes some of those situations just really involve, people not knowing that they're overstepping, particularly in terms of those financial arrangements. So sometimes education can really go a long way. We can also refer the person to appropriate organisations that can provide them with some, additional safeguarding supports that they want and need. So our collaborative work with a range of organisations is really, really important. In some cases, supporting the person to access alternative accommodation free of abuse is something that we've been involved in. For example, we had a recent situation where we supported a lady who had always lived with her family, where she'd actually been subjected to abuse, to actually move into her own home for the very first time. And our staff actually, worked really flexibly in that situation, helped to arrange things like furniture and food hampers, things like that, to really ensure that she was, able to and felt supported in that new environment. Our ASU staff have had to adapt to the COVID-19 restrictions, as we all have, by communicating by phone and online platforms where possible in lieu of those non-urgent home visits, because we know that many older people who are, really wary of COVID-19 haven't wanted that, at this time, having people in their homes. So we've tried to make alternative arrangements where possible. As well as responding to reports, the Adult Safeguarding Unit has a strong focus on the prevention of abuse through early intervention and community awareness and education. So since last October, the unit has undertaken over 80 presentations, and that's been to a diverse range of stakeholders, including community members, as well as non-government and government organisations. Obviously, with the COVID-19 restrictions, the number of presentations has declined, but we're really hoping that will start to pick up again now. And we're also exploring alternative ways of delivering presentations via Zoom, webinars, things like that, to ensure the broad promotion of the unit can continue. To support this community education work, we've also established 8 Ageing Well community networks, and that was the original idea from those actually came from that British Columbia model that Jeff spoke about. And those networks are really to bring together the community connectors, the professionals and others committed to supporting the rights of older people, particularly in those groups that we know might not necessarily engage, with us, as the adult safeguarding unit quite as effectively. So people from linguistically and culturally diverse background, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people from LGBTI community members, and also in rural and remote communities. So these networks really aim to raise community awareness of the rights of older people and elder abuse prevention strategies to helpfully build informed, well-connected and safe communities. So by using trusted networks, we're also hoping that some of these communities might overcome some of the hesitations they have around accessing the supports of the adult safeguarding units, and so supported to access our services where required. So just quickly, during this time of COVID-19, our broader office has actually sharpened our focus around the importance of maintaining social connections and wellbeing, and supporting older South Australians to do so in ways that kind of align with the new normal. We've recently partnered with a range of organisations looking to reduce social isolation and loneliness that's particularly stemmed from this period. For example, we've been funding COTA SA to deliver the postcards from behind the COVID curtain project, which has really engaged older people, particularly those who aren't comfortable or confident to connect online, to share their experiences about the pandemic in their own handwriting. So they're submitting some postcards. And actually Jane Mussered sent me one this morning, which is really about a lady who is about to turn 100 and her feelings in relation to feeling a bit sad, but happy that she can that she'll be able to actually spend some time with her family because it's a month away, so as the restrictions are easing. So some of those have been really lovely to see, and also enabled people to really connect at this time. We're also funding Multicultural Communities Council of SA to develop a website which is about COVID-19 information, particularly around mental and physical health, which all of their member organisations can access to help keep ethnic communities connected. Our seniors card program already connects with members in a number of ways, but at the moment we've been using our platform, so our Weekend Plus digital magazine, our direct marketing emails and our Facebook page to communicate consistent targeted messaging around social distancing, the restrictions, other relevant information to our 90,000 odd seniors card members. So this information has actually been really well received and addressed some significant areas of concern for older people who are living in the community who weren't necessarily seeing themselves in the mainstream COVID-19 messaging. Of course, along with this health information, we've also had other information about, where to access mental health information and support, food delivery options, address some concerns about people, receiving mail or handling money, as well as fun things like streaming concerts or which museums they can visit online, gardening ideas, that sort of thing. A number of people have mentioned already the aged care restrictions, and so we've actually been meeting with the aged care peak organisations as well as some other representatives from the sector and ARAS and COTA to discuss some of the key issues around relevant to older South Australians, particularly in relation to the restrictions to aged care. These conversations have really enabled us to balance the need to protect people, our most vulnerable community members, from COVID-19 whilst also maintaining their broader wellbeing, because we know that those restrictions have had a significant impact on people. So by having those conversations and listening to the voices of older people and the sector more generally, we've actually been able to make some changes to our legal direction and the messaging as our situation has evolved in South Australia. So finally, I just wanted to share some exciting work that we've been doing to co-design a new Stop Elder Abuse awareness campaign with Aboriginal elders, which is going to be progressively rolled out in partnership with metropolitan and regional Aboriginal communities over the next 5 years. We previously worked with Wadley-Paringa Aboriginal Research Unit at Samarin around what keeps you safe to help determine some appropriate resources to support Aboriginal elders and their communities to prevent mistreatment and stay safe. And now we're drawing on the cultural expertise of our Aboriginal, Ageing Safe Aboriginal Community Network members to help inform the elder abuse campaign artwork and the messaging, and to help spread the message. We've had Nurrungeri artist Jordan Lovegrove, who works with Dreamtime Creative, and he's created some original artwork and some tailored key messages. And so that's going to kick off on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day on Monday, so keep your eyes peeled for that. So we've certainly been living in some really strange times right now, but really by working together, even if we can't be physically together, we can continue to ensure that the rights of older people are upheld and to reduce the risk of elder abuse in our communities.
Thank you very much, Cassie. That's fabulous, and such a lot of work happening. Great to hear about. So thank you to everybody. We are running over time. I really appreciate that people have stayed with us. So thank you very much for doing that. If you have submitted questions, or if you have other questions to submit, please do that. We'll make sure that we get the responses back to you. And if you'd like to connect with ARAS, please do that via all the social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or directly. You have a feedback poll in front of you now. We encourage you to fill that in. It helps us with responding for next year, and we hope we'll be with you next year and we won't be talking about COVID, which would be very nice indeed. We just wanted to end this forum with a lovely video about a mum and her son and what her son is doing for her. So if you can stay and watch that, please do. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today, and stay safe and stay well. Thank you. Goodbye.
Lockdown and isolation, and what we've been plotting and scheming to do is to try and create a memorable moment, an experience for my mum. And of course, having vascular dementia and Alzheimer's, she's not necessarily going to remember what we do for her on Mother's Day. So we're going to create a little experience. We're going to film it so she can enjoy it on Mother's Day as many times as she wants, and we can share it with you guys as well. One of my favourite memories as a kid is my mum and dad used to take me down to the big Sydney Aquarium twice a year. We sit there all day long with a packed lunch, and we just marvel at the aquarium displays. So we're at the moment just cutting out these big sheets of baking paper. We're trimming it and sticking it on the inside of the window glass there. You can see Levi and Bree in the background getting that one ready to go up. I'm going to hook a projector up on the kitchen bench here. We're going to project a vision of fish swimming on the inside of the windows, and hopefully plan of attack is when it gets dark outside. That should look like the inside of the house is an aquarium. I'm going to bring Mum out through her door down the stairs. You're going to set up a nice comfy chair for her here, give her a blanket, glass of bubbles, and where the family's going to reveal back the curtains on these windows behind me here. And hopefully, if all goes to plan, what my mum should see is an aquatic display swimming through the windows. So we're going to try and project on the inside of these windows an aquarium display swimming through the house. And whilst I know she's probably not going to remember this beyond the immediate moment, the thing I would love to see her do this one. Alright, let's go get over and surprise her. Yoo-hoo! Woo-hoo! Hello! Hey, darling. I've got a little surprise for you outside. I've got a little surprise for you. Oh. Alright. Hang on a second. Let me help you.
Oh. There you go, madam.
Oh, a little blanket. When I was a little kid, you and Dad used to take me down to the big aquarium in Sydney.
Oh.
Keep watching the windows. Rightio, guys, open up the curtains.
Happy birthday!
We couldn't bring you to the aquarium, but at least we could bring the aquarium to you, huh? You like that?
It's unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. I don't think we will ever forget this. No.
He's hoping we don't.
Yeah, no. They said I've never seen anything like it, and it's very beautiful.
So last night when we were sitting here, we were sitting in the same spot watching these windows.
Yeah.
Do you remember what was going on in the windows? We were all sitting here, but it was in the dark. We were all sitting here, and you...
Everybody saw it except me.
No, you were here as well. You saw it as well. You saw it as well.
I did saw it as well.
Yeah,
okay.
you were watching it as well.
I can't remember what they said last night.
No? Can you remember what was in the windows?
No.
No? We had something swimming through the windows for you last night.
Swimming fish?
We had fish swimming through the windows.
Yeah.
And those windows, yeah, we had fish swimming all through it for you.
No.
Bit of magic.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the office staff. Bye.
Bye.